Good morning to COBRA. My name is Maurice Crespi. I'm the managing partner of Schindlers Attorneys. COBRA has been set up as a pro bono initiative between Schindlers Attorneys, Engaged, and IQbusiness. We now have over 40 partners who have all come and joined as part of COBRA in collaboration to assist businesses in distress in various ways. We set up private Zoom meetings with you and your team, if need be, to answer questions. We deal with the legal aspects of business rescue. We can assist in advising on business rescue. But importantly, COBRA is not about business rescue. COBRA is about avoiding business rescue. So the idea of COBRA is if you're in distress, we have over 1,000 professionals to assist on a pro bono basis, provide the advice, and avoid the business rescue only in circumstances where a creditor is applying pressure. Does one go into business rescue? There are certain other commercial aspects or commercial reasons to go into business rescue, such as post-commencement finance, but it's mainly because of the moratorium. And in the present climate, the moratorium is not as needed as it used to be, simply because creditors and debtors are being reasonable. As part of the Pro Bono initiative, we also provide these daily webinars on various topics. We have webinars on Mondays where we deal with business rescue in general. These webinars can also be found on our website, www.cobra.org.za. And if you have any queries, please email info@cobra.org.za. So today we have a very, very exciting topic. Paul Michael Keichel will be hosting today's webinar. He was recently on the Alan Avery show. He is a legal expert without a close second in South Africa. He's dealing on a commercial level, he's dealing with licensing, and he engages the public on a regular basis in advising and assisting the policymakers in respect of the current policy. Now, South Africa at the moment, there's a lot of talk of the regulatory environment being a problem and the red tape, in fact, being a big, big issue, and was dealt with on the Alan Avery show. And I'm sure it'll also be dealt with today. Today, we will be looking at the economic aspects of cannabis. We're going to be focusing on that. So there may be a lot of questions by the audience in relation to licensing and the process in obtaining a license. There's another webinar on the 11th that you're all invited to, which will be dealing with that. But what we've also arranged is that somebody will be, you can ask the questions that won't be addressed live, and we'll either write them and provide an answer, or we'll get back to you with an answer. So I'm going to hand over to Paul Michael. He's going to be doing the introductions of the remainder of the panel. Paul Michael, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maurice. I'm incredibly excited to be chairing this presentation because what it means is that cannabis has emerged from the shadows and can now be taken seriously by the business community as a topic of interest. As will emerge from this, hopefully, cannabis has a massive potential to boost our economy, but only if done right. Now, COBRA has, with thanks from us, brought together some very relevant experts today. We hope that the attendees leave with more clarity and a better appreciation of what ought to be in our future when it comes to cannabis. So the order of events for today is that I'm going to provide a brief introduction and also address each panelist's contribution. After each panelist has provided their contribution of approximately 10 minutes each, there will be opportunity for a general discussion between us and also for various questions to be answered. Now, I am an attorney. I'm a commercial litigation attorney at Schindlers Attorneys, and thanks Maurice for that, I'm an expert in as much as one can be an expert in cannabis and human rights law. I'll provide a brief history in a moment as to how I became involved. I'm today's host and also the master of ceremonies, as it were, and I hope to stitch together today's discussion from a legal perspective because Our other speakers come at this from different angles. Our first contributor after me will be Sifiso and Skenjana. He's the lead of internal research and thought leadership of the internal thought leadership team at IQbusiness. He has 11 years industry experience and prior experience in running an economic research and strategy advisory company. He's experienced in asset management, strategy and management consulting. He holds an MSc Finance and is pursuing a PhD on development finance and economics. He's a columnist for Business Day, Fin24 and the Sunday Times, and regularly contributes on ENCA, Newsroom Africa, Power FM, Kaya FM, and SAFM. And today he will talk to the economic big picture and the numbers underlying the potential for a future cannabis economy. And he'll work with his fellow co-panelists to talk towards how to make sure that maximum benefit is extracted from a cannabis industry and that nobody is left behind. Coming from the perspective of nobody being left behind, following on from Sifiso will be GG Alcock. He's the author of KasiNomics and KasiNomic Revolution. He's a third world child, and I'm pretty sure that he will explain to you what this reference means. He's a specialist in informal and Kasi being township economies. He's experienced in marketing and route to market strategies. And he'll talk on the massive scale and the intricate dynamics of the informal sector, including rural cannabis growers, and he will share ideas and business models which capitalize on opportunities to engage with and build business models which are tuned to the informal economies. He will work with our co-panelists to talk to how the small guy, being the small-scale cannabis farmer or the matchbox cannabis salesman in the townships or on the street corner, is not going away. And this small guy ought not to be left behind and ought to be considered and concluded in whatever strategy it is that we adopt as a country going forward. Finally, before moving on to our general discussion, we'll have contribution from Pierre van der Hoven. He's a cannabis entrepreneur and founder of Cannabis. He's the former founder of ETV, YFM, and Tuluntulu, which is a mobile content platform. He's former government appointee as innovation ambassador. He has a lot of insights into what it is that government is thinking presently around cannabis, and he will be able to speak to how interdepartmental disagreement, misunderstanding, and a drive towards over-regulation is in fact getting in the way of cannabis plants getting planted into the ground, and what we can do practically about that. In other words, how we can better start thinking about and around cannabis. So before we kick off, I hope not to step on the toes of our other speakers, but how this journey started was that in my final year at law, I wrote an essay around how we might approach a constitutional challenge against the prohibitory laws around cannabis in South Africa. That got onto the cannabis networks, and eventually I became the attorney for the so-called Dagga couple, of which I'm sure many people are familiar. We got involved in 2013 as Schindlers, and we started running what came to be known as the trial of the plant. It was a trial action in the Pretoria High Court, which brought together a whole lot of experts and expert opinion and we started presenting the evidence around how the prohibition of cannabis was justified by government on the unjustifiable basis of certain racist and unscientific laws. And we got about halfway through that trial before the government started playing dirty and hit us with about 4,000 pages of discovery documentation mid-trial. And that trial was then postponed. In the meantime, the case of Prince and others came before the Constitutional Court, and we made the election to intervene in that matter. And we successfully intervened, and we contributed to the end of 2018 Constitutional Court judgment, which I'm sure most of you would be aware of by now. Essentially, what that judgment did was it decriminalized the personal and private use of cannabis by adults in South Africa. What also coincided, or what that judgment required of government, was that within 2 years, government puts into place certain reactive laws. These reactive laws are the laws that are supposed to fill the gap that is created by this order of constitutional invalidity. Now, what the judgment did not do was it did not mandate government to create a recreational cannabis industry, nor did it mandate government to create a hemp industry in this country. So these issues still remain the prerogative of Parliament. It needs to be a decision by our duly elected officials in order for such an industry to be created. Now, as Pierre van der Hoven will certainly speak to you about, there seems to be different ideas from within government as to whether or not this is going to be a reality in the future. For example, we've all heard Tito Mboweni raising the battle cry for a formal hemp industry and a formal cannabis industry. The Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Agriculture seem to be supporting him in this call. Whereas you've got more conservative departments, such as the Department of Health and the Department of Justice, who seem a little bit more cautious and aren't so sure as to whether this is a good idea. So we're still waiting for government to speak with one voice. And then, of course, there's this interesting role of SAHPRA, being the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. They are part government, part not government. They get some of their funding from government, but then a lot of their funding comes from license applications, as it were, or cannabis license applications, which begs the question as to whether they are not in fact conflicted, because they then want to keep cannabis within their sphere. They want to be the regulators of everything cannabis, and if their very survival depends on owning cannabis as an industry, it may be that they are the ones who are extending all of this red tape and getting in the way of cannabis getting off the ground. Of course, the bigger question around this is, if not, why not? If you do not want to create a cannabis industry, why not? If you are already allowing people to grow it in their gardens, smoke it, etc., all of the harms associated with cannabis have not been prevented in this scenario. So why not generate significant tax revenue and contribute to South Africa getting out of the economic slump that has been created by COVID-19? Now, insofar as this 2-year deadline is concerned, certain parliamentary mouthpieces have already indicated to the media that the deadline will be missed, which means that the transitional arrangement that was created by the Constitutional Court, the one that we find ourselves in now, persists after the deadline. So all of those who want to sit and smoke cannabis on their private stoep, you may continue to do so. We don't take any steps backwards when the 2 years has expired, but we don't necessarily take any steps forward. Obviously, you have to proceed with the caution that you have been proceeding with anyway, because our experience is that different jurisdictions treat cannabis differently. For example, if you are arrested by the Randburg South African Police Services and you are then prosecuted in the Randburg Magistrates Court, it may be that the police and the prosecutors have a different idea of what is allowed in respect of the judgment to, for example, if you go to Douglasdale or a rural area. So you have to exercise caution, because you cannot bet on police and prosecutors being sympathetic to your rights as a cannabis user, or at least not yet. What also happened, and this will be dealt with extensively in our forthcoming webinar, is that on the 22nd of May of this year, last month, the Minister of Health, by way of Government Gazette, rescheduled certain components of the plant, of the cannabis plant, the cannabinoids. Now, CBD, if it falls below certain thresholds, is now a Schedule 0 substance. Now, being Schedule 0 doesn't suggest that you may freely trade in it without consequences. There are still certain licenses that are attached to it, and Schedule 0 substances are treated as so-called complementary medicine. And SAHPRA and the Department of Health have in fact been taken to court around the definition of complementary medicine and how being overly strict in these definitions and license requirements is in fact getting in the way of not only cannabis entrepreneurs, but also the ability of individuals to make the personal decision to get their hands on what they consider to be an effective natural remedy. So if SAPRA is too strict about it, it gets in the way. And this is the red tape that we keep talking about. THC being the stoning or the active cannabinoid within the cannabis plant that gets you stoned has now fallen into Schedule 6 in terms of the Medicines Act, and that has replaced what we used to call dronabinol, which was a very specific formulation of THC. What this does mean from a practical perspective is that cannabis is being acknowledged as medicine, because prior to this judgment, cannabis used to be treated as having absolutely no medicinal benefit. So this is certainly a step in the right direction. What has also happened in terms of this amendment is that the Department of Health has acknowledged that it has no business dealing with hemp. Hemp is still the cannabis plant, but hemp refers to the non-psychoactive uses of the cannabis plant. So if you are using it to grow fiber, and from that fiber you want to press it into bricks and build low-cost housing, or you want to use that fiber to knit yourself a pair of socks, then this is what we are talking about when it comes to hemp. And the industrial applications of the cannabis plant are in the tens of thousands. And I'm pretty sure that Pierre or somebody else in this group will mention that to you. However, when it comes to CBD and THC, what we still find is that through the Department of Health and SAPRA, licenses are required for absolutely every step in the supply chain, other than Schedule 0 CBD, which may now be openly sold in stores. But it begs the question as to how you get your hands on that CBD. Because if you're getting that CBD from somebody who didn't have a license to produce it or to distribute it, then you are party to a drug deal in the strict legal sense, and you may be charged under the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act and as having contravened the Medicines and Related Substances Act. And please do join us for our following webinar, because we are going to get into the debate around what is a complementary medicine and whether we ought to treat complementary medicines the same way that we treat medicines in the strict sense, being if you want to make strict medicinal claims around it and guarantee that this medicine is effective for a certain ailment that you wish to treat. Now, in order to close, before I hand over to the next speaker, we need to ask the question as to what a regulatory regime needs to look like in order to not be too onerous to allow people into the market. Now, from a legal perspective, it must be so that any restriction on our rights, and that includes restrictions to purchase cannabis products for personal consumption or to get into the cannabis space in order to earn a living and boost the economy, any restriction on those rights needs to be considered within the framework of what harms it is that we are trying to prevent. So if it is so that you are doing more harm through prohibiting people from engaging in a certain activity because they go to jail, they get a criminal record, then the harms that you are actually preventing, those harms that are associated with consuming cannabis, if any, then you are not reasonable and rational in your lawmaking and in the application of the law, and you as government are opening yourself up to further constitutional challenge and litigation. It begs the question as well as to the wasted opportunity and the harms that are associated with not grabbing at what is an incredible economic opportunity, and do those harms outweigh any harms that are associated with cannabis trade and the consumption of cannabis. And of course, putting people into prison for using, possessing cannabis or selling cannabis, do those harms and all of the associated harms outweigh any harms that we are preventing? So if we are too strictly regulated, then it is reasonably clear that we do not extract the maximum economic benefits that could befall us from a regulated cannabis industry. And there is also this risk, and I'm sure GG and Pierre and everybody else will speak to this, that if the red tape is too long and the costs associated with breaking into the industry are too high, then it is only the already rich and the multinationals who continue to get rich. It's not the everyday cannabis entrepreneur or the small-scale matchbox farmer or the Eastern Cape Gogo who has the opportunity to break into this market. And this is what we're going to be speaking to today. And Without further ado, let me hand over to our next speaker. Sifiso, please take over.
Thanks, Paul. It's quite an interesting one, and I guess, you know, for me, the initial challenge to even my colleagues on this panel is a question around how do we look at policy and regulation as enablers for market development, and where do we start in ensuring that the way in which we have the conversation certainly energizes a positive conversation around policy being an enabler. So historically, it seems that we've taken a top-down view around policy and regulation, in terms of we first want to create the legislative framework and then contextualize the market conditions in which that can actually work optimally. And I think an important way for us to certainly look at this is to start at the market or with a market view and backward engineer and reverse engineer into how it then cascades up into a policy framework or into a legislative framework as well. And so I think that's one of the, I think certainly important things, in that we ought to think about also as market participants, even in the legal fraternity, to ensure that the tone in which we're bringing to the conversation is certainly not a hostile one, but around how do we actually create an enabling environment for a marketplace to operate. The estimates for the current size of the cannabis market is about 150 billion US dollars, and that's just the direct market. Of course, I'll speak to some of the things that speak around the indirect market around that. And in an African context, I think Lesotho was one of the first countries to move towards decriminalizing cannabis and cannabis industry. And there are a number of other countries that are at various levels of consideration within the cannabis law, within the laws around decriminalizing cannabis: Botswana, Swaziland, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. And some of the questions then that will come and say, well, what do we use cannabis for, or what could we use it for? And a big portion of the market globally uses cannabis or hemp. For hemp, they use it for fuel, and that's biodiesel as well as ethanol, and textiles. And of course, now there's the medicinal avenue that's growing, is quite specifically aggressively in the context of the size of the basin which it's growing from. And California alone, in 2018, I think had a hemp or cannabis market of about 3.5 billion US dollars. And that's just a state, right? And so when you then contextualize that, it certainly is one of those crops that does offer value, but we ought to then contextualize around, how do we have the conversation around the value that the crop itself offers. So one of the challenges that we find in South Africa, and one of the economies that I find that are an interesting case study for South Africa to learn something from, specifically in the context of this, is Israel. Israel, 2007 and 2008, the country was a drought-stricken country. They were pretty much water scarce. And in a South African context, we're pretty much going through the same thing. One of the reasons Lesotho, I think, continues to be a trust fund baby for South Africa is because of the CMA agreement that we have with them, where we procure water from them. But over and above that, we are a water scarce country. And, and as of this year, or actually as of 2018, Israel is now a water abundant country, right? And they've got more water than they can use. And the thing that drove that specifically is the investment into desalination as a technology. And so it's how do you convert seawater into consumable water, either for agricultural purposes or consumption at home. And in a 12-year period, they moved from being drought-stricken to being water abundant. And if you look at their investment into R&D as a proportion of their GDP, it's over 5%. And I think it averages over the 12 years about 4.5, but at some point it did get to about 6%. If you look at South Africa, our target for R&D as a percent of GDP is 1.5, and we're currently coming in at about 0.8% of GDP in terms of how much we spend R&D as a proportion of GDP. The challenge is that you can't. It's hard to scale an industry when you don't invest in the knowledge economy. And if you just look at the largest economies globally, one of the things that they got really good at is the investment into knowledge. And interestingly enough, South Africa, is a lead exporter in a lot of crops, particularly in the horticultural space. Deciduous fruits, citrus, we're the #1 exporter of citrus. Yet our agricultural research to output percentage is less than 0.5%, right? And so there's certainly a disconnect between our comparative advantage that we enjoy from an economic front, as well as then the investment we're putting in to ensure that we remain a market leader. That means that we end up buying or importing the technology for example, genome production and all of those things that we ought to be having internally as an economy that's one of the largest exporters in that particular space. And so I think the agricultural sector in general has certainly been a laggard in terms of the investment into R&D that they've been making and that they ought to make. And that's certainly then one of the value points that we can create around the economic benefit that cannabis offers for the economy is research and development. That then informs the development of labs for testing. But over and above that, once we actually get into real hard, active economic activity, then you can follow the entire supply chain for cannabis. Right? There's the cultivation or the initial farming process. After that, there's cultivation, extraction, and processing, and that's a full value chain that then starts to solve for some of the structural issues we've got in our economy in terms of one, the value of our agricultural contribution to GDP, but also the pace at which agribusiness is growing, and we've seen that agribusiness mostly has been horticultural driven, and this would be quite an interesting contribution in that space. And one of the interesting things around then when you go into the manufacturing process is the oil pressing, and that's where you're able to get ethanol. And currently we get ethanol from other food sources like wheat, for example. And so when we're thinking around ideas of food security as well, is that now we have an opportunity to look at non-food sources to create biofuels. And that's certainly important because then we start to use the food source for food, right, and for consumption. And so it's certainly, I think, an interesting crop in terms of the value that it purports to bring into the South African market. And there are countries that we've got really good, trade and I guess political relationships with, like Canada. And Canada is one of the largest researchers in this space and also one of the largest industries in this particular space. And so, so these are the economies that we could certainly look to partner with in our development of our own technology and research capacity, as well as then how does that cascade up into manufacturing capacity and an end user market, in whichever way that end user market looks like, whether it's in a textiles context, whether it's in a medicinal context, or whether it's in a fuel context. Either way, I think South Africa is in a perfect opportunity or perfect space to truly explore this opportunity. But I think the most important thing that's going to be critical is how we are able to take a market view and work back into ultimately how then that cascades up into a legislative framework as well as a policy framework. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much, Sifiso. Over to Pierre. Sorry, apologies. Over to GG. I got the order wrong.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share a presentation here. Paul, can you see that?
It's starting to load. Yes, we can see it, I believe. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. So just a brief introduction. My name's GG Alcock. I grew up in a mud hut in a Zulu village in a place called Msinga, which just by chance is also probably one of the largest dagga growing places in South Africa. It's generally hard to tell people where Msinga is, but nowadays it's quite easy. I say it's right next door to Nkandla. So what I want to talk about in terms of KasiNomics and cannabis is that we generally have this perception of the economy being driven by large corporate entities, and a lot of the investment into cannabis has been, for instance, if we look at Canada, these large corporate agribusinesses. But the experience has been both in Lesotho and particularly in Canada is that the economics of this aren't panning out. So this large scale corporate growing and propagation isn't really making any sense. And I believe that the real opportunity in South Africa is around building businesses around the small grower and the informal economy. And I'm going to show some of the components of the informal sector just to show some of the scale of it, because I think there's generally this perception that the informal economy is rows of hawkers and little spaza shops which don't make much money. But there's a huge KasiNomic, what I call KasiNomics is basically the economics of the township, of the Kasi, but it's obviously outside of the Kasi, it's all around us. So just as an example, on the right-hand bottom there's a lady, I call her Golden Delicious. She's in downtown Johannesburg. And she sells 3,000 vetkoek every single day for R1 each. She also sells about 500 rands worth of tea and coffee, polony, fish, cheese slices, and so on. So she and her husband turn over 3,500 rand every single day in 6 days a week. And their margin's about 50% of that. So this person's earning around 1,500 rand a day every single day, and they're building a 2-story house in Soweto. And we walk past her and we go, oh, shame. On the left-hand side, far left, there's a lady at a school in Tembisa who sells snacks to school kids, snacks and lunch to the school kids. And I was chatting to her and I said, how long have you been in business? And she said, 26 years. I was like, yo, 26 years selling from that little table. She said, I put 2 children through university and my husband has been unemployed over that whole time. She makes herself a profit of 6,500 Rand a month for selling for 3 hours, first break, second break, and after school. And to put that into perspective, there's 10,000 township schools, an average of 5 ladies per township school. It's a huge sector. And there's in other sectors, the spaza sector, the fast food sector, for what I call Kasi, of course, on the top right there is what's called a gorda. It's a quarter loaf of bread with slut chips and polony. And in 2004, I introduced Parmalat tea slices into the gorda sector. And today, Parmalat earns about 2.5 billion Rand a year in turnover from tea slices going into a sector that was never considered as an opportunity before. In fact, kind of did you know is that if you took all the Parmalat tea slices sold into the sector every single year and stacked them one on top of the other, they would reach to the moon and halfway back. Anyway, there's a number of large sectors. There's about 100,000 what I call spazas or spazaret supermarket type outlets, turning over 200 billion Rand a year. Put that in perspective, the formal retail sector is around 350 billion Rand a year. About 50,000 fast food outlets turning over 90 billion Rand a year, a massive sector of vegetable traders and schoolyard hawkers, 50,000 hair salons and 60,000 stylists turning over 10 billion Rand a year. And just the backroom rental sector, which is for spazas or residential rental, earns 40 billion Rand a year for South African township households. And there's a multitude of other sectors which I won't go into. The point being is that there's this huge sectors with a large number of outlets. But if you consider the aggregated scale of that sector, there's very large amounts of turnover going through that sector. The muti sector is another, the trade in plant-based muti. If you, and in Africa, plants are seen to have protective and healing power. And just the muti market in South Africa, I wrote in my book, KasiNomics, that it was worth 3 billion rand a year in 2004 or 5. Last year, some work done by a few universities said that it was worth 18 billion rand a year, employing 150,000 people. And this is a multitude of small or large muti sellers. No one supplies the sector in terms of the barks, the bulbs, the leaves, the plants. No one does it commercially or on an agricultural basis. And these are either poached or scavenged off the hillsides and so on. But if we just look at China, China has a large, what they call TCM, which is plant-based traditional Chinese medicine. And the TCM sector turns over about 30 billion US dollars a year in a range of different plant-based medicines. In fact, Coca-Cola, AstraZeneca, Nestle, and a whole bunch of corporates have entered this muti sector. And many of the products in China are very similar to the South African plants. So of course, I'm not talking pangolins or rhino horns or stuff like that. This is very much a plant-based sector. And what they've discovered in China is one of the big problems is that very few of these plants are commercially planted. And so it is really small-scale foragers or small-scale farmers who are supplying this 30 billion rand a year sector. If we look at the goat sector on the right-hand side there, that is a ship in Somalia being loaded with goats. And the Somali goat trade, where they sell these goats to Saudi Arabia, they sell 3 million goats a year and they turn over about 6 billion rand a year in sales to Saudi Arabia. And all of these goats that are being sold to Saudi Arabia and other Middle East countries are in essence reared by small-scale farmers who bring them into these massive markets at the coast once a year and then sell them. And in fact, there's a shortage of goats in the Middle East at certain times of year. My brother, Silan Msinga, runs a goat agribusiness project. And what they've been doing is aggregating small farmers. So in essence, helping individual small farmers, who are generally women, into helping them with veterinary breeding programs and so on. So not large farms, individuals of a woman who has 10 or 15 or 20 goats. And in essence, with these small-scale auctions, just in 2019, they turned over 80 million rand in sales in 5 districts across 4,000 small-scale farmers. And this is over and above any sales of goats that went outside of their auction yards and stuff they've set up. And it just indicates the potential of growing this. This 80 million rand never existed in incomes in the sector. And it's a very different model, which is in essence a model where small-scale farmers come to a central marketplace, they sell to speculators, these speculators take the goats and then sell them in the pictures on the bottom there around the cities. These are goat sellers and sheep sellers selling outside the townships of Soweto, and every township in the country has these goat sellers who are in essence buying through this channel. But then coming to the subject at hand, the view, the top picture there is the view from my mother's house in Msinga overlooking the Tugela River. And those little fields that flank the edges of the Tugela are dagga fields. And these dagga fields are tended by ladies like in the bottom pictures. In fact, the blonde girl there is not a grower. She happens to be my daughter admiring the large dagga fields close to my mother's house. I paddled down the Tugela and wrote about this in one of my books, and the dagga fields continue down the Tugela, the Buffaloes, the Sundays, and other rivers for hundreds of kilometers. And what's happened is that this sector is become, with unemployment and stuff, hugely popular. And what was a old Gokos planting has now moved to where young men are entering into the sector, and are actually, most of these fields have irrigation pumps and irrigation systems irrigating this, and a multitude of downstream or upstream businesses supplying this. There's a huge bucky brigade in Msinga, and when you ask these guys who have these buckies, what do you do? They say, "Asithengi sama Benjis." We sell peaches. Of course, there's not a single peach tree in Msinga. It's far too arid and hot. So they're supplying this. And I was chatting to a local tire supplier in the local town, and I said, "How's business?" He said, "Business really shit." So I said, "Why? What's wrong?" He said, "Well, the police just burnt all the dacha." And he loses on his tire business 40% of his business the week after the dacha is burnt by the police. Of course, the police have other issues these days, so very little burning happens. The lady on the right-hand side, that bag over there, she sells for 5,000 Rand, which is a bag full of dacha. And I did a bit of research around it. That same bag on the streets of Johannesburg sells for 400,000 Rand. This gives you a sense of the scale of the sector and the multiple steps that go through it. The reality is that most of this dacha growing is completely in the open nowadays in Msinga. So despite any of the legislation, all of these dacha fields, you can see on the top left of the picture at the top, there's a road coming in there. The road literally goes 5 or 10 meters away from these dacha fields. It's very much in the open and is considered a great source of income. And is very closely aligned to the goat industry, because the bag on the bottom left there is not dacha, it's goat dung, and the locals will tell you that goat dung has the best dacha results that you can get. So what is the point? I think if we look at a gig or a shared economy worldwide, a gig and a shared economy, a different way of doing business, is growing and will continue to grow as large corporate structures struggle under COVID and prior to that even. So what is a gig and shared economy? These are about hugely fragmented economies. So a multitude of individual small business that together make up a large one. Think Uber with a multitude of individual cars, Airbnb and so on. Hyper-personalized. They understand who their customer is. They are networked. So they are networked through technology in terms of Uber or Airbnb. In terms of the informal sector, it's very much about being geographically linked in a marketplace and so on. But very importantly, there's this aggregator or multiplier effect of technology. And this is where I believe the huge opportunities lie. So instead of looking at having a huge farm and growing acres of dacha and processing it and stuff, there are a lot of other models that have shown this supply and source from fragmented markets. So if we look at Starbucks or the free trade coffee movement, Starbucks, for instance, in Costa Rica and Central Africa, supplies coffee bushes or seeds to the growers. There's a multitude of individual growers. They then bring their seeds into a central point, and from those central points, Starbucks grades it and then takes it on. In India, the farming sector in India for dairy, for instance, you don't have large dairy farms like you would have in America or South Africa as an example. It's a multitude of small farmers who have 3 or 4 cows, and they have a model where in essence a truck drives down the road on a certain day of the week and takes 20 liters here, 50 liters there, and so on. And I believe here lies one of the big opportunities. Instead of investing in this capital, which has been shown most places in the world to not benefit a large-scale growing, is to consider the opportunity to source from these multitude of small dacha growers in places like the Eastern Cape, in Central KZN, and Msinga, and so on and so forth. And it's also about investing in networks and tech versus this farmer production. So what is the opportunity to source from the multitude of small farmers via the Bucky Brigade Uber model? So a multitude of these farmers, these Bucky Brigade, as I mentioned, who are selling peaches, are able to source and bring to a central point. So they can source from a multitude of farmers, or alternatively, link these farmers to marketplaces. And I think one of the other opportunities is how do we potentially have different models, for instance, where we buy from and process within that sector. So the opportunities in my mind are about, we don't have a highly technologically driven informal economy. Let's develop these tech solutions for the sector, geolocations, payment ordering systems. And engage, we can engage through changing our business models and engaging people on a completely different business model. And well worth looking at the Starbucks and free trade coffee models or the India dairy milk models. Obviously, there's legalities and that kind of element to be addressed, but you currently have a vast number of people currently growing dacha in there, generally, I believe, very high quality dacha. How do we manage to bring them into the economy, grow this inclusive economy, and build kind of cooperative business models? Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, GG. That was incredibly insightful, and I think gives us the picture. The question which now I'm going to hand over to Pierre for answering is really, Pierre, we know very well that the regulations as they stand don't cater to this KasiNomics model. All of these people who are growing from a small-scale KasiNomics perspective are still rendered criminals in terms of our law. So you're a cannabis entrepreneur, you have big ideas for the economy in South Africa. How do we build this economy and how do we regulate to include these small-scale farmers and small-scale distributors without rendering them criminals, and bring them into the economy and allow them to grow with us?
Thank you. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I think Pierre has dropped a little bit, at least from my side.
Okay. Yeah, the other speakers have covered a lot of these big issues. Is it bad connection again? Hello?
Yeah, it's very bad.
Okay, maybe if I stop the video.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. All right. So I think we've covered a lot of stuff with the previous speakers, and the big dilemma is exactly the question that's just been asked: is how do we take a first world, highly technical, global, medically driven industry and end up with employing small people, small farmers, and particularly small farmers in Africa. Now, the background is we have hundreds of thousands of these farmers, as GG covered. They have already been growing cannabis for many years, and South Africa's been leading it. On the other hand, we've got Canada that's legalized cannabis. They've created a very high-tech industry. There's a lot of influence from the pharmaceutical companies, and their logic is to kind of capture the industry for the big corporates. And what we need to do in Africa is find a balance between these two, and I think we can. We're blessed with fantastic climate. Cannabis loves Africa, and Africa loves cannabis. So there's not only a local market, it's destined to be the production hub of cannabis around the world. The international players have realized when South Africa gets its act together, it will dominate the industry, because it has in the past and it will in the future in terms of cultivation. Unfortunately, the key word in your question, Paul Michael, was legal. We have a very complicated legal environment, and that's being unraveled. But there are models where you could include your small farmers to become small outgrowers, very much like the Starbucks model. Our view on the medicinal cannabis is you can create genetics, you can distribute it to the farmers, you can provide training and support, and you can do your GMP quality control around the extraction process. A lot of the world cannabis market has moved from flower, which is predominantly used for adult use, to now derivatives from cannabis. So if you do your quality control and you build a GMP standard facility, good manufacturing practice facility, there is a possibility to include the small farmers and still compete globally. The market globally is estimated north of $250 billion. It is a massive industry. It's growing all the time. The hemp industry is in its infancy. It's the exponential growth happening in America and around the world around hemp is quite amazing. So it's not like we're going to use up this industry. The potential for growth is massive. Yes, there's increasing supply, and yes, it's driving down the cost of primary production. But that's in Africa's favor, because our costs of production are low, so we'll end up competing very successfully. The question is, do we want to turn Africa into a farming community and export the raw cannabis? And the answer is no. Then we're going back to a previous kind of colonial model that's not going to work. We need to do beneficiation. So we need to comply with international standards and build a value chain. And this is a critical element of which there's a lot of disagreement. There's certain people going, cannabis belongs to Africans and it should only be for small farmers. And the other people going, it's a pharmaceutical product and it's really the ambit of big business. And again, there is a middle road here. I think we should focus on cultivation, build our country as an absolute leader in cultivation, include small farmers, but don't stop there. We have to build a value chain. We have to build upstream technology-driven processing plants. In the case of hemp, it's going to be around decortication factories, processing for hempcrete, plastics, biofuels, that kind of stuff. And in the case of cannabis, it's processing of flowers and derivatives for CBD and all kinds of other terpenes and extracts. So beneficiation is critically important to the success of our industry. So where are we? We're not doing very well. Other African countries they've got a not a very good model. If you partner with government, you can make a lot of money with government, but the citizens are locked up, and that's not really a great model in my opinion. But we are getting bogged down in red tape. It took us almost 2 years to get hemp research permits, okay, which are of little commercial value. The commercial licensing application process has been open for a number of years now, and there are hardly any plants in the ground. So we are struggling. Zimbabwe launched a model last year that was really government-owned, government licensed, partner with government partners, and last week they undid that completely, making it 100% private sector owned. You can do it on private land. So Lesotho is currently regarded as the hub. Yet again, South Africa has the better climate. I'm currently in the Eastern Cape. This is the place called the Dagga Belt. It's also the area that's, there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of rural people, and again, hemp and cannabis can be the silver bullet that can not only provide jobs, but provide stimulus to the local economy and, very importantly, rural economic development. There's a lot of thinking in government, but government's very fragmented. There's some people who are keen to get this going. The president stood up in Sona. He spoke about small farmers. The Minister of Finance is very pro. But there are other departments and other schools of thought that are much more conservative. They see cannabis as a drug. Their thinking is driven by fear, fear of diversion. So it's fragmented. We had the permits being issued by SAPRA. SAPRA has now announced that the permits will no longer be issued by SAPRA for hemp. That's moving to the Department of Agriculture. But I was engaging with them yesterday to say, okay, who do we talk to at Agriculture? And they couldn't tell us. So again, it's being bogged down in red tape. There is talk about a kind of a THC traditional healer kind of permit or license coming into existence, which I think is hugely positive. Again, GG touched a little bit on plant-based medicines. There's a huge market there. So there's a lot of work to be done, and the frustrating part as an entrepreneur is time is marching on. The world is learning, and we are just not getting plants in the ground. The criteria has got to be plants in the ground. All this debate about this point and that minor legal issue is not helping the people on the ground. Although, again, some of the traditional leaders have said to their people, go ahead and plant. But the problem with that is that's only product for adult use, and adult use is not under consideration in South Africa yet. When you start talking medicinal, you have to go for a full-blown license. The Farmers Weekly estimated it's 2 million rand to get a license, but the real issue there is you have to build your facility before you get the license. And this is a risk profile that a lot of investors are not prepared to live with. And you combine that with expropriation without consultation, and suddenly you're getting a lot of investors who are investing in Africa, but they're not investing in South Africa. So policy certainty and some real firm commitments to the industry are absolutely critical, and the money will pile into this country. But at this stage, it's a bit of an uphill battle. Yeah, I see we're running out of time, Paul Michael, so we can go to questions now if you'd like to.
Yeah, thank you very much to all of our panelists. I think that's been incredibly insightful, and I think everybody who's joined us can have an appreciation of just how multifaceted this question is and how many things we need to get right in order for this to be sustainable. And it seems that, or sustainable and viable, and it seems that largely the answer comes down to, well, leave us alone and allow us to do our own thing. Allow the industry to drive itself instead of you dictating exactly how you as government dictating how the industry ought to look. We do certainly have a few questions that haven't yet been answered. The first was one that was actually posed on the chat. Well, more of a statement, but I think it's something that we ought to throw around as co-panelists, and this is from Julian Stobbs, in fact, from the Dutcher couple. He says the cannabis export market is almost dead, and this is presumably because everybody who wants cannabis is waking up to it and growing it themselves. We have to get it right here at home first. Racing for export is unsustainable. We have a huge market here at home, SA first. And I think that's a very good point, because, you know, Jules has been on the ground. He's been a cannabis activist along with Myrtle for decades now, and they appreciate just how many cannabis users there are in the country. And surely that ought to be our launching pad for this industry. Pierre or anybody else who would like to comment on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's dead. There's a considerable interest. There's a lot of landrace strains. There's the cost of production overseas in terms of lighting, indoor cultivation, or cultivation in a place like Israel, for example, is very expensive. So I still think there is a market, and we're being approached, interestingly enough, for the export of flour, as opposed to oils and medical products. So I think there is an international market, but Julian's point is taken. There is increasing supply globally, and a lot of people see only that side of the equation, but there is another side of the equation, which is increasing demand. And I think ultimately, when all's said and done, Africa and South Africa in particular will be able to compete better than most in terms of low-cost production of cannabis.
No, fair. So it's a multi-pronged approach. Let's not focus on one or the other when, you know, multiple of these avenues might be viable for us. Point well made and taken.
Maybe I can add to that. Yeah.
Please do, GG.
I mean, I think that one of the big things is that by keeping the sector, particularly the small-scale sector or informal sector, I'm talking about either illegal or informal, you're able to not bring it into the formal economy, not contribute to it, not tax it, not regulate it, and so on. And so just like the illegal tobacco we're seeing over the lockdown period, what happens is that you actually inflate prices. So the grower, to a large extent, doesn't benefit as much from pricing, because the person who benefits is the Bucky Brigade who run the roadblocks and so on. So I think there's a massive opportunity on two levels. One is that you can increase the benefit to the small-scale grower down on the ground, whether they're in the Eastern Cape or Msinga or whatever it might be. On the other hand, you're able to bring them into the net in terms of getting tax or any other form of licensing payments or whatever it might be. So the benefits, I think, are multiple. And if we look at just this tobacco lockdown, we can see the negatives of continuing with the current status.
Yeah, if I might just add one last point there. Again, when we think blue skies around the sector, we also have to look at the nuance and the context for South African economy. We have had 12 years of jobless growth in the economy. And so a sector offering economic growth does not necessarily mean it'll have the widespread and inclusive benefits into all participants in the economy. And I think that's why also we have to allow for some space to have consideration around what does it mean to make an emergent sector an inclusive sector, to ensure that we've got the right level of participation. And so even in our consideration around accelerating the legislative frameworks that become enablers, we have to make sure that it does tick the very important boxes around inclusive economic participation.
Excellent, thank you. I see that certain of the questions are being answered in text by the panelists. We do have a few outstanding, so I think if we could get to those. The first is by Alta, which says, if trade is mostly in cash, then difficult to record. I presume that that's directed at GG. Of course, that I would imagine that the answer would be something along the lines of, well, that is a fact, but KasiNomics continues despite how we attempt to regulate and enforce. So GG, if you'd like to address that. And also the following question by Nati, which is, can we sustain current levels of around 30 to 70 cents per gram to the grower?
Cool. So I think the cash issue is an issue throughout our economy. And we need to find ways to decash the system. If you just look at East Africa with M-Pesa, there's very little cash that moves around because they've got this fantastic payment model, and we just haven't managed to do that in South Africa. And I think one of the opportunities lies in how do we create payment systems that are cost effective. And I won't go into detail around it now, but basically, if you pay by card, it costs, we've got one of the highest levels of non-cash payment in the world. It costs you 2.5% to pay using a card. In China, it costs you 0.05%. So we need more of these models, because I think some of these decaching models would assist growers because of the risk of cash and the difficulty and so on that has as a result of the cash system. But also, if we do want the government to earn tax, and that's debatable, then of course, if it's decashed, there's easier ways to manage that. But I think that this is an issue that goes throughout the informal economy and small businesses in the formal economy as well. And it cries out in a huge opportunity of developing better cash, decashing or payment systems.
Paul Michael?
Apologies, I was muted. GG, if you can also quickly address the second one by Nati, can we sustain levels of around 30 to 70 cents per gram to the grower? Pierre, you might also want to jump in there, because I think what this comes down to is whether we can create some sort of value chain and cooperative model. Pierre, perhaps you can also jump in and address the next question, which is there a plan to invest in education and training so that the primary producers or small-scale farmers can be involved in beneficiation? Because having spoken to you previously, there are certainly plans in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think training and education is absolutely critical. Supplying the right genetics as demanded by the by the market is critical. Protecting the local genetics is important. And using technology such as smart payments for e-currency, recognition, seed-to-sale software. There are many tools right now that actually can enable it. It needs the co-op structure could be a point where a lot of this is done. So you try and erect a co-op structure within the rural areas like the Transkei, and people go there, they get seedlings, they get training, they get disease prevention. There's a lot of knowledge around the use of pesticides, insecticides, that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely important. And again, it just talks to this need to build a value chain and not focus only on small farmers. While they are crucial and politically they're very important, without a value chain, you're getting a situation where a lot of people are planting and they can't sell their product. So it drives them into the black market. So yeah, it's all of those elements are critical.
If I can answer the one about the cost, I can't comment on those specific numbers, but just across the board, what we saw, the minute personal growing or use was legalized, the amount that people were getting in a place like Msinga meant that costs dropped fairly substantially, probably about 20 or 30%. What it meant was the marginal growers popped out of the system, but many of the people who were unemployed, young men, for instance, who previously had jobs in the cities, were growing it on a much larger scale, and they were able to absorb that. I think that the reality is that the reason the gig economy or sharing economy does well is because, as a rule, they have very low overheads. And the same as, whether an Uber or Airbnb, or the same in the informal sector, because people have such low overheads, they're able to adapt and absorb these pricing much better. It doesn't mean that's a good thing, but they're certainly able to continue to survive because their overheads and other cost structures are much lower. And this is another reason why they're able to compete with the large corporate or industrial size farm.
Thank you very much. I'm going to link two questions together. There's an observation by Jules again, there are no licenses for adult use, and another observation by Charles Henning, or at what point in the legislative process can we anticipate the arrests to stop? And I think that's a little bit of a legal question, so I'm going to answer it. As I mentioned up front, the Constitutional Court didn't mandate government to implement a cannabis industry in respect of what we term responsible adult use, or as some people would call it, recreational use. The only thing that government is required to do is to allow cannabis users to grow their own cannabis at home and to consume it personally and privately. But that again does beg the question, what about the people who do not have a private garden, or they don't know another cannabis user, or for that matter, they don't have green fingers, or they can't afford to join a cannabis club or whatever it is? Why are we discriminating against these people or their ability to obtain cannabis in a formal market? And if we were to create a formal market for responsible adult use, or if government decided to enable that, then we would need to see amendments to the Drugs and Drugs Trafficking Act or standalone legislation. And presumably then the arrests would stop. Charles, going back to your point, unfortunately, we do have this system in place where drug users are treated as the low-hanging fruit by police officers. And while there's a law that they can abuse, they will do that to continue arresting and making the lives of cannabis users difficult. So that's what we really need, is government to decide that they are going to allow for a recreational cannabis industry, as it were. We do have some other questions. I think let these be the last questions, because I do think we need to wrap up because we are running a little bit over time. Somebody has asked, who are the reliable cannabis seedling providers in the Gauteng region? That's not one that I don't think any of us know the answer to that, nor could we really provide it, because at the moment there is no formal cannabis economy unless you are licensed in terms of the Medicines Act. And there's another question, and I think let's wrap up with this. Whoever believes that they can contribute to it, how would panelists suggest keeping small-scale growth sustainable in the long run, or is the ideal vision that we develop our small-scale farmers into large commercial producers in the long run? I imagine that this speaks largely to the hub or the cooperative model that Pierre and Julian have been speaking about in the chat. So perhaps Pierre and GG could contribute and finally tie it all together as to what sort of model we see working that merges KasiNomics with formal economics.
Yeah, I can come in there. Absolutely. As people progress, they can move up the value chain. And you know, my contention is we need at least 10 massive South African companies to compete on a global level. But ultimately, it's a business, and we need to find clients who are prepared to firstly invest in the industry and secondly buy the product on an ongoing basis. So if we can start on the one end with educating, as we touched on earlier, the small farmer, and at the other end building a globally competitive industry out of Africa, then there's scope for everybody. And of course, if successful entrepreneurs need to become big companies and big corporations, and there needs to be plans to do that. However, we also have tribal land, where the parcels of land, the issues with land ownership, there's issues with land size. And because cannabis and hemp is a high value cash crop, it can work in those environments. So I think in an ongoing basis, there'll be a space for everybody. All kinds of models will work.
I think it probably is time to wrap up. I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and indeed special thanks to our panelists for joining us today and providing such insight. I think all of you can see that this is multifaceted, it's complicated, and it's ever-changing. So please keep up to date by following us and following COBRA and keeping a finger on the pulse. And no doubt, as and when there are updates, material updates, we will update you on those things. Please continue to join us for our webinars. They are always highly informative, they're highly topical. And thank you very much. And Maurice, if you'd like to say something in closing.
Yeah, thanks to the attendees, thanks to the panelists. I must point out that GG Alcock he's joined COBRA, he is a COBRA partner. And the reason I mention that is because COBRA is not only about big business. COBRA is about all businesses. We are assisting at a spaza shop level all the way up to big business. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we're not about business rescue. We're about assisting businesses out of this in any way possible. And it's all businesses across the board. Thanks so much again to the panelists and to the attendees. We have another webinar this afternoon at 3 o'clock. So if you can go to the COBRA page and sign up for that, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll see you on Monday, hopefully. Thanks again, guys. Cheers.